You know, I don't believe, though, that there's any character on television with whom the public identifies more than this horse character that you play.
In the early days of the series, when I was trying to find this character and I was really working at it.
Insights like him weighing 14 pounds at birth, his career almost becoming an athlete, the piano box burial myth, and Dirk's choice of character acting. The stunning confession. At 67 years old, Dirk Blocker has finally peeled back the curtain on his father's life, and what he admits has left fans stunned. For decades, the world saw Dan Blocker as the lovable giant Hoss Cartwright from Bonanza, the cowboy with a goofy grin and a heart as big as the Ponderosa Ranch. But to his son, that same man often felt like a stranger, a father torn between Hollywood fame and the quiet family life he longed for, but rarely had time to enjoy. Dirk doesn't sugarcoat it. He remembers the late nights, the missed dinners, and the endless crowds that seemed to follow his dad everywhere. He describes it as both honest and a little sad, a raw confession that strips away the nostalgia and reveals the truth. Behind the smile was a man exhausted by his own success. And yet, that's only the surface. Because the real story of Dan Blocker is far more complicated and far more human than anyone ever realized. To understand why Dirk's words matter so much today, we have to rewind. Back to a Texas town where a boy was born so big that the nurses whispered he might not even fit in the cradle. Back to a family grocery store where humility clashed with destiny. And back to the moment when Hollywood discovered a gentle giant who was never quite allowed to be just a dad. A giant from birth. Dan Blocker didn't just enter the world, he made an entrance. Born in 1928 in the tiny town of DeKalb, Texas, he tipped the scales at a staggering 14 pounds. For years, locals swore it was the heaviest baby ever born in Bowie County. And whether or not that record still holds, one thing was clear from the very beginning. Dan Blocker was larger than life. Nurses laughed in disbelief, neighbors gossiped about the giant baby, and his parents quickly realized they had a child who would never blend quietly into the background. His father, Ora Shack Blocker, and his mother, Mary Arizona Blocker, ran a modest grocery store in the small town of O'Donnell. It wasn't glamorous, just a simple shop where the community bought their flour, sugar, and canned goods. And little Dan, even as a boy, was put to work. He carried heavy bags, stocked shelves, and hauled groceries out to customers' cars. His size made him a natural for the heavy lifting, but his father used to joke that Dan's sheer bulk was bad for business. "I ought to pay someone just to hire him," he once quipped, "so he doesn't scare off the customers." But there was something else about him that drew people in. For all his intimidating frame, young Dan had a gentleness to him. Neighbors remembered how he'd crouch down to help younger kids reach a jar of candy from the counter, or how he'd smile shyly when praised for his strength. Even then, his presence was unforgettable. A paradox of raw power wrapped in kindness. Growing up in Depression-era Texas wasn't easy, but Dan's size and quiet determination gave him an edge. At school, he towered over his classmates, but instead of using that power to intimidate, he learned to use it to protect. Teachers often relied on him to break up playground fights. His mere appearance was usually enough to calm things down. No shouting, no fists, just a steady presence that demanded respect. It was the first glimpse of the man he'd one day become. A gentle giant, whose strength wasn't in how loud he was, but in how steady he stood. And though no one could have predicted it back then, those same qualities, the mix of towering physicality and tender heart, would eventually make him a legend on television screens across America. Small-town dreams, big character. By the time Dan was a teenager, there was no hiding his size. At 6 feet tall, before most of his friends had even hit a growth spurt, he looked more like a grown man than a high school kid. Classmates called him Big Dan, and coaches whispered that he was destined for the gridiron. In a town where Friday night football was practically a religion, Dan Blocker was expected to be the next local hero. And for a while, it looked like he would be. At Texas Military Institute, he threw himself into athletics, playing football with the kind of raw force that left defenders gasping. His broad shoulders and tree-trunk legs made him unstoppable on the field, and scouts took notice. A future in football wasn't just possible, it seemed inevitable. But here's the twist. While everyone else saw a linebacker, Dan discovered something entirely different. At Sul Ross State Teachers College, between practices and weight training, he wandered into the drama department. What started as curiosity, maybe just a way to meet new people, became a revelation. Under the stage lights, he found something he couldn't get on the football field: a sense of purpose. Acting gave him freedom to be more than just the big guy. He could be funny, vulnerable, even tender. And the audience didn't just cheer for his size, they listened to his voice. That duality became the hallmark of his life: physical power balanced with unexpected sensitivity. One professor recalled that Blocker could terrify an audience with a single glare, then disarm them seconds later with a boyish grin. He was, in short, unforgettable. Still, life was far from easy. The world was on edge, and by the time Dan graduated with his degree in speech and drama, war was calling. His classmates were heading overseas, and Dan, never one to back down from duty, followed. He would trade the football field and the theater stage for the mud-soaked battlefields of Korea. And it was there, thousands of miles from the small Texas town that raised him, where Dan Blocker would prove that his strength was more than skin deep. War hero before cowboy. When the Korean War broke out in 1950, Dan Blocker traded stage scripts and football pads for an Army uniform. At just 22, the gentle giant from Texas became Sergeant Blocker, serving in F Company, 2nd Battalion, 179th Infantry Regiment. This wasn't desk work. This was boots in the mud, rifles in hand, and the constant echo of artillery shaking the ground beneath his feet. Blocker saw real combat. He marched through the frozen hills, slept in trenches, and carried the weight of survival on his back. In one skirmish, he was wounded, earning him the Purple Heart. Alongside it came a row of honors: the National Defense Service Medal, the Korean Service Medal with 2 Bronze Campaign Stars, and the Combat Infantryman Badge. These weren't Hollywood props. They were tokens of courage forged in blood, sweat, and fire. And yet, even in the thick of war, Dan's gentle nature stood out. Fellow soldiers recalled that he could break up fights in camp with nothing more than his presence. At over 300 pounds, his sheer size was enough to stop anyone in their tracks, but he never resorted to brute force. Instead, he diffused tempers with calm words and steady eyes. One veteran later said, "Blocker wasn't just the biggest man in the platoon. He was the calmest. You felt safer just knowing he was nearby." This was the paradox of Dan Blocker, a man built like a fortress, but whose greatest strength was his compassion. It was a trait that would follow him all the way back to America, where, instead of cashing in on his size, he chose something humbler. After the war, he didn't head straight to Hollywood. He went back to classrooms, chalkboard in hand, molding young minds. But those years in Korea never left him. They gave him a sense of mortality, a realization that life could end in an instant. And when he eventually stood in front of the cameras as Hoss Cartwright, that quiet awareness of life's fragility bled into every smile, every kind word, and every gentle gesture. He wasn't acting kindly. He knew the value of kindness because he had seen a world without it. Hollywood Knocks, Opportunity Answers. By the late 1950s, Los Angeles was bursting with opportunity, but for most actors it was also a city of broken dreams. Dan Blocker knew the odds. He wasn't a polished leading man, and he certainly didn't look like one. What he had was presence, raw, unforgettable presence, and that was something casting agents couldn't ignore. His first big break was hardly glamorous. In 1958, Blocker appeared in a slapstick Three Stooges short called Outer Space Jitters. Billed under the name Don Blocker, he played a hulking alien goon, stomping around in costume while Larry, Moe, and Curly threw pies and pulled faces. It was silly, almost absurd, but it got him in the door. From there, the roles trickled in. He popped up in shows like Gunsmoke, Colt 45, The Rifleman, Zorro, and Have Gun. Sometimes he was a bar bouncer, other times a nameless outlaw or a hulking thug. He rarely had more than a few lines, if any, but every time he walked on screen, viewers noticed. He had that rare ability to command a room without saying a word. But here's what set him apart. While most big guys were typecast as mean or menacing, Blocker's natural warmth always shone through. Directors started to realize that behind the barrel chest and intimidating frame was something far more unusual, a gentle giant. And then came the moment that changed everything. In 1959, NBC was casting for a bold new Western series. It wasn't just about gunslingers or cattle rustlers. This one would focus on family, on a widowed father raising three very different sons on a sprawling Nevada ranch. The show needed heart, humor, and humanity. And for the role of the middle son, they wanted someone unlike anyone audiences had ever seen. When Dan Blocker walked into that audition room, towering, calm, and soft-spoken, the casting team knew they'd found him. Becoming Hoss Cartwright. The role was Hoss Cartwright, and it wasn't just another cowboy role. It was the beating heart of what would become one of the most iconic TV westerns of all time, Bonanza. NBC was taking a gamble. Westerns were everywhere in the late 50s, but most followed the same formula. Lonely gunmen, dusty saloons, and black hat villains. Bonanza was different. It was about family. A widowed patriarch, Ben Cartwright, and his three sons trying to build a life together on the sprawling Ponderosa Ranch in Nevada. Each son had his own personality, and for the middle one, they wanted someone big, strong, and unforgettable. When Dan Blocker walked into the casting room, 6'4", over 300 pounds, with a handshake firm as steel and a voice gentle as a Sunday hymn, the producers knew instantly. This wasn't just an actor who looked the part. He was the part. Hoss wasn't written to be the toughest or the smartest. He was the soul, the one who could stop a bar fight with a bear hug or make a child laugh with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Blocker played him with kindness, humor, and a touch of vulnerability that audiences weren't used to seeing in westerns. Week after week, viewers fell in love with him more and more, and that love turned into loyalty. By its peak, Bonanza was pulling in tens of millions of viewers every Sunday night. Families gathered around their living rooms, and when Hoss appeared on screen, people cheered. Fans wrote him letters, hundreds of them. One note from a young boy cut straight to Dan's heart. "I wish you were my dad." For Dan, that single line carried more weight than the ratings or the fame. It reminded him that what he was doing mattered, that his character wasn't just entertainment, it was comfort, safety, even a kind of fatherhood for kids who didn't have it at home. But while the world saw him as America's favorite cowboy, his own children sometimes saw something else. Missed birthdays, crowded outings where strangers lined up for photos. A father pulled in two directions. And as Dirk Blocker admits today, that tension, the tug-of-war between the man the world adored and the father they wished was home more often, was the hidden cost of being Hoss Cartwright. Family man versus national treasure. To America, Dan Blocker was Hoss Cartwright, the lovable cowboy who made the world feel safer every Sunday night. But inside his San Fernando Valley home, he was just Dad, and that's where the real battle played out. Dan married Dolphia Parker, the woman he'd met back at Sul Ross State University, long before Hollywood came calling. Together, they raised 4 children, 2 boys and 2 girls, in a house that grew right alongside his fame. As Bonanza soared, the Blockers expanded their home. More bedrooms, a game room, even a swimming pool. On paper, it was the picture-perfect life of a television star. But Dirk Blocker remembers the truth differently. Everywhere they went, the outside world followed them in. At ballparks, at county fairs, even at Disneyland, fans swarmed. Strangers wanted hugs, handshakes, and photographs. For everyone else, Hoss Cartwright was a national treasure. For Dan's kids, he was the dad they had to share with the entire country. Dan tried to keep his family grounded. When agents urged him to move to Beverly Hills, where the schools were better, he refused. "If the schools in the valley are good enough for regular kids, they're good enough for mine," he told one reporter. And he meant it. He wanted his children raised among everyday people, not Hollywood royalty. At home, he and Dolphia ran a tight ship. They created something they called the 8 o'clock club. Every night, the rule was simple. If you weren't asleep by 8, you lost your membership for a whole week. To outsiders, it sounded silly. To the Blocker kids, it was sacred. It gave them a routine, a sense of belonging. And while Dolphia played the enforcer, Dan was the soft one, the teddy bear who tucked them in, kissed them goodnight, and called them his pretty good crew. But even then, the line between reality and television blurred. His children watched him ride across the Ponderosa, take bullets, wrestle outlaws, and win impossible fights. Dan reassured them it was just acting. But kids don't separate fiction from fact so easily. Once, during a particularly intense episode, his daughter burst into tears when Hoss was shot. She ran to him, checked his head for blood, and asked if he needed an aspirin. Moments like that cut deep. Fans saw the cowboy. His children saw their father hurting even when it was only pretend. And behind his smile, Dan often wondered if he was missing the best years of their lives. Health, heartbreak, and sudden death. For all of Dan Blocker's energy, kindness, and larger-than-life presence, there was always one shadow he couldn't escape.